Hello learners, I am here to talk to you about the linkages in nature. Before starting with the topic, we should have a clear idea of what is an ecosystem, what are the characteristics of an ecosystem, what are the components of the ecosystem, the different classes of the biotic components, the basis of the relationship among different living organisms in the ecosystem, what is the food chain, food web, and the trophic levels? What is their functional relationship in the ecosystem? The flow of energy in the ecosystem and the energy transfer through different trophic levels. Whether the components of the ecosystem can exist in isolation, and how are the activities of the tourism industry related to nature and the environment. So this chapter or this unit is divided into 3 sections. The first one, we will talk about the ecosystem and the components of the ecosystem. In the next unit, we will be talking about the food chain, the food web, and the trophic level and the flow of energy in the ecosystem. And last, we will be talking about how they are interrelated with each other, the interdependence and the interrelationship among the different organisms in the ecosystem, and how they are linked with each other, and how are the activities of the tourism industry, the anthropogenic activities, how do they affect the nature and the environment. So starting with the first topic, we should first know what an ecosystem is. As we all know, the environment encompasses a plethora of life forms, and these life forms are interlinked with each other, making the environment a dynamic entity. So these life forms, although they are all interlinked with each other, not one organism can exist in isolation. They need to be associated with each other, whether it is the own type of organism or another type of organism, and along with that, they have to exist along with its habitat in which it is residing. For example, a plant requires sunlight for manufacturing its food, for photosynthesis. It requires light, temperature, water, and inorganic nutrients for its growth. Animals depend on the plants for food and shelter. And also the microorganisms, which are minute particles or organisms present in it may be present in the atmosphere, it may be present in land, it may be present in the soil, etc. They totally depend on other organisms, that is the dead organic matter from the plants and the animals for its growth, for its nutrients. It derives its nutrients either from the soil, from air, or from water, and in turn they provide the nutrients to the other organisms. So there exists a relationship or a linkage between the various components of the environment, be it a biotic, a life form, or an abiotic environment. It is impossible to separate the environment and the nature. The environment covers the whole biosphere, which includes different kinds of life forms, that is the biotic factors, and these living life forms, they form a wave of life and spread throughout the biosphere, covering from the deepest oceans to the highest mountains, from the coldest region to the hottest deserts. The abiotic factors constituting the physical environment such as soil, water, air, light, etc. make conditions suitable for life to exist. So the linkage, there exists a relationship between the biotic and the abiotic factors in the environment. Now the term ecosystem was first coined by Sir Arthur Tansley in 1935. He defined it as a system resulting from the integration of all living and non-living factors of the environment. Whether it may be a tiny microorganism, or it may be a plant, or it may be an animal, there exists a relationship, or there is an integration between these living creatures along with the environment or the non-living factors of the environment like the soil, air, water, etc. In 1953, E.P. Odum defined ecosystem as the basic functional unit of nature, which includes organisms and their non-living environment, each interacting with one another and influencing each other's properties, and both necessary for maintenance and development of the system. So the ecosystem, according to E.P. Odum, defined it as the basic functional unit of nature, including all organisms and non-living environment. Now, in order to understand the basic ecological principles of the environment, we first need to identify the area which we would like to study. So, if we want to study a particular area or a particular ecosystem, we need to first study whether the area is easily accessible, whether it is easy to handle, or it is an appropriate size. It may be a pond, it may be a lake, it may be a forest, or it may be a desert. Whichever ecosystem which we would like to study needs all these factors or information so that we can find out the basic ecological principles of that particular environment. The components of the biosphere, that is the atmosphere and the earth, cannot be studied as a unit because it is too large. We cannot study the ecosystem of the earth. We cannot study the ecosystem of the atmosphere because it covers a huge area. And so, we need to further subdivide and select a small area to study its ecological principles. We cannot take the earth. The earth is so huge that just we cannot cover a vast area. And so, you need to subdivide. You need to subdivide these areas. Now, the earth can be subdivided into continents, but then the continents are also too large to be studied. And therefore, the continents are then subdivided into forests. It may be a forest. You can divide it into a forest area. You can divide it into a desert area. And again, for your easy accessibility or for your convenience, you can again divide them into island. You can study the island ecosystem. You can study the pond ecosystem, or you can study the grassland ecosystem. So you need to divide or subdivide to cover up a small area or to study a small area of an ecosystem. Now, an ecosystem can be the biosphere, it can be the earth, it can be the forest, it can be the river ecosystem, it can be a lake ecosystem, it can be a pond ecosystem, island, even a wheat field. You can study the ecosystem of the wheat field. You can study the ecosystem of an aquarium also. You can study the ecosystem of a jar of pond water. Inside that pond water, there will be so many living microscopic creatures inside that jar of pond water which you have collected from the pond, and even a rock with lichens growing on it. Suppose you have lichens growing on the rock, you can even study that the organisms growing on it. In tourism, you can study it is the ecosystem of a destination which you can study. So there exists an ecosystem within an ecosystem and another within it. The whole biosphere is an ecosystem, so also its components, that is the earth and the atmosphere. So the ecosystem is a unit of nature that is in itself an independent functional entity. Ecosystem consists of biotic and abiotic factors with an integrated network and connected with each other. They vary in complexity and the basic ecological principles and processes although remain the same. Now let us study what are the components of this ecosystem. The ecosystem, as we all know, has two major components, the abiotic components and the biotic components. The abiotic components, like the non-living inorganic material, such as carbon, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water, etc. and the organic compounds like protein, carbohydrates, etc. And then you have the light and temperature. In the biotic components, the biotic community constitutes that of the autotrophs, which are the producers, and the heterotrophs, which include the consumers. So the autotrophs, they are able to manufacture their own food, while the heterotrophs, they depend on other organisms for its survival. Now these heterotrophs, they are again divided into the phagotrophs, that is the macro consumers such as animals that ingest other organisms, and saprotrophs, that is your micro consumers like the bacteria and the fungi, which break down the complex organic matter and release inorganic nutrients used by the plants. So the components of the biosphere include the abiotic and the biotic factors. Now if you consider an island ecosystem, for example, in the island ecosystem, there exists an interaction between the biotic and the abiotic factors, and this forms the ecosystem of the island. In this ecosystem, you will find that the biotic components comprises of the tall trees, the herbs, the shrubs, the rodents, the birds, the butterflies and the microorganisms. All these constitute the biotic components. The dead leaves, the twigs and the fallen branches, they cover the ground where a number of microorganisms act upon it and convert it into the litter. There are homes of the rodents, there are hidden burrows, there are tunnels and underground nests. So all these constitute the biotic components of the island ecosystem. Now the abiotic components include the soil, air, water and light. And so there is an interaction or interdependence between these biotic and the abiotic factors to make up or to form the island ecosystem. The biotic factors like the trees, herbs and shrubs, butterflies, rodents, birds and microorganisms, they along with the abiotic factors, that is the soil, air and water, there exists a linkage or there exists an interaction between these two components or factors to make up the island ecosystem. So this is an example of another ecosystem, a pond ecosystem. So you can see in this pond, there may be phytoplanktons growing, there are angiosperms, you can see the beautiful nymphia growing there. All these plants, they contribute as the autotrophs. The pond ecosystem or the phytoplanktons and the angiosperms, they are the autotrophs in this ecosystem. The consumers who are the consumers here in this pond ecosystem? The zooplanktons and the fishes which are in this pond constitute the consumers, and then there are the decomposers, include the microorganisms, or the microorganisms act upon the dead plants and the dead animals, or the zooplanktons and fishes, and they convert it into nutrients which provide to the plants, which they provide to the plants. Now, the living organisms, they require energy for their growth and maintenance of the body structure, and the energy is derived from the food they eat. So all these living organisms, they require food for their growth and maintenance of the body structure, and they derive this food or energy from other organisms. So all these living organisms, they are related with each other through food. So the organisms, they are divided into two categories, that is the producers and the consumers. So what constitutes who are the producers, or what constitutes the producers? The green plants are the producers. They are able to manufacture their own food by utilizing light as a source of energy for making the food using carbon dioxide, water and minerals. The trees, the diatoms, the green algae and the phytoplanktons also produce food. The green algae, for example, you have your volvox, you have chara, etc. They are also able to produce food. The trees, the diatoms, they all are producers. The consumers include the animals and the microorganisms. Now these consumers are again divided into 4 types. They are the herbivores, the carnivores, the omnivores and the detritus feeders. So the herbivores, what are these herbivores? These herbivores, they survive, or they derive their energy by eating only the plants, while the carnivores, they eat or prey on the animals. There are another category of these consumers which we call as the omnivores, where they eat both the plants as well as the animals. Then we have lastly the detritus feeders, which feed only on the dead or partially decomposed remains of plants and animals, and they obtain the energy from these dead organic matter. The bacteria, fungi, earthworms, termites and maggots are examples of these decomposers. So after studying this chapter, or after studying this unit, you should be able to define what is an ecosystem, what are the components of the ecosystem, the biotic and the abiotic factors of the ecosystem, what is a herbivore, what is a carnivore, what is an omnivore, and what are detritus feeders, who actually are the producers and why are the producers an essential component of the ecosystem, and what would happen if all the decomposers stop working. Thank you.